When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allies inherited a colossal arsenal. Millions of rifles, machine guns, cannons, tanks and aircraft that had sown terror in Europe. From the legendary Mauser rifles to the feared Tiger tanks, everything remained under the control of the victorious powers. But what happened to this immense military loot? Some weapons were immediately destroyed, others were stored, and many more were distributed among Allied armies or turned into war trophies. Some secret technology even ended up serving as the basis for rearmament and the military industry of other nations. In this video, we'll uncover 15 fascinating stories of what happened to captured Nazi weapons after World War II. From secret caches to surprising reinventions. Prepare to dive into the hidden legacy of the war's abandoned arsenal. This is what they did with the weapons captured from Nazi Germany after World War II. The fate of the captured K-98K rifles. Following the capitulation of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the Soviet Union inherited a military booty of colossal dimensions. Among all the captured equipment, from Panther tanks to flak anti-aircraft guns, one weapon stood out that had been in the hands of almost every infantryman in the Third Reich: the famous Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle. This rifle, a derivative of the Mauser family, was the standard-issue weapon of the German soldier. More than 14 million were manufactured during the conflict, with production spread across arsenals from Berlin to occupied Prague. By the end of the war, millions of Kar-98Ks were stored in warehouses or surrendered with surrendered troops, piled up in sheds, railway depots and trenches that became improvised weapons depots. The Soviets were quick to organize this immense inventory. Specialized military brigades, known as trophy brigades, scoured former combat zones to collect, sort and evaluate each weapon. The Kar-98Ks underwent technical inspection. Those in good condition were cleaned, oiled and carefully packed in wooden crates, bearing labels indicating their origin and serial number. Those damaged beyond repair were dismantled and their steel melted down for industrial reuse. Unlike other captured weapons, such as certain cannons that were immediately sent to reinforce Soviet units, most of these rifles were not intended for immediate use at the front. Instead, the USSR understood their value as a strategic reserve, insurance against a possible future conflict. Thus, hundreds of thousands of Kar-98Ks remained stored for years, soaked in preservative oil, stacked in military depots throughout the Soviet Union and its satellite republics. Sometimes decades passed without anyone opening their crates. However, the Cold War altered this seemingly silent fate. As Moscow began to support liberation movements, communist guerrillas and new governments in Africa, Asia and Latin America, these stockpiled rifles became a currency of power and geopolitical influence. Many Kar-98Ks were reconditioned in Soviet or satellite arsenals, receiving new markings, serial numbers and accessories before being shipped to Allied countries. Egypt received shipments of these rifles in the 1950s, destined for its army and Palestinian militias. Syria, which was modernizing its armed forces with Soviet assistance, also benefited from this supply. In southern Africa, Angola saw thousands of German bolt-action rifles reappear in the hands of MPLA fighters, while others ended up in the jungles of the Congo or with guerrillas fighting Portuguese colonialism. Kar-98K recycling was not limited to the Eastern Bloc. In Western Europe, countries like Czechoslovakia used the machinery from the Brno factory, which had manufactured the rifle under German occupation, to produce the Pushka Versi 98N, a derivative version that equipped its army and was exported to other nations. Belgium, for its part, used captured stocks and surplus components to assemble the FN-98. another variant that served as a stopgap solution until the arrival of modern automatic rifles like the FNFAL. One of the most unusual episodes occurred with Israel, which in its early years purchased large quantities of Kar-98Ks from Europe. Many of these rifles still bore the Nazi eagles and swastika engraved on the receiver. To remove this stigma, they were milled or covered with Hebrew markings, and paradoxically, weapons that had served a genocidal regime became tools of defense for a newborn Jewish state. Over time, the spread of semi-automatic and automatic rifles relegated the Kar-98K to the background. However, these rifles continued to appear in isolated conflicts and guerrilla warfare throughout the second half of the 20th century. Some examples were kept as reserve weapons in state arsenals well into the Cold War, while others remained stored in depots abandoned or looted after the dissolution of the USSR. Today, the Karabiner 98K is a highly coveted piece for collectors of historic weapons, museum restorers, and sport shooters interested in its design accuracy. At auction, a good example can fetch high prices, especially if it retains original production markings. From the battlefields of Stalingrad to the shores of Africa, passing through the dusty warehouses of Eastern Europe, the long history of the Kar-98K reflects the contradictory fate of Nazi weaponry, created as an emblem of conquest, repurposed as an instrument of revolution or survival, and finally transformed into a silent testimony to an era where the world was reshaped by fire and steel. Metallurgical recovery for industry. At the end of World War II, a significant portion of the vast arsenal captured from the German army on the Eastern Front, rifles, artillery pieces, tank armor, and ammunition, was neither stored nor kept as a strategic reserve. The Soviet Union took a different path, transforming this war material into raw materials to rebuild its own devastated economy. During the first post-war years, special brigades known as trophy units scoured ruined cities, battlefields, and abandoned depots, meticulously sorting through all recovered German equipment. Those items that were in minimally usable condition, complete rifles, functional machine guns, or repairable barrels, were allocated to military reserves or redistributed to the USSR's allies, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries in the socialist bloc. But the majority of the captured weapons were in suboptimal condition. Many rifles were deteriorating, artillery pieces were obsolete, and vehicle armor had been damaged beyond repair during the fighting. The Soviet interpretation of the agreements of the Potsdam Conference, held in 1945, was categorical. German military capability had to be eliminated down to its foundations. Where other Western powers chose to stockpile some of the material or channel it to arms markets, the Soviet Union saw in all this surplus a unique opportunity to fuel its industrial reconstruction. Thus, between the late 1940s and early 1950s, thousands of tons of German steel began arriving at Soviet foundries. Mauser rifles, destroyed Panzer armor, helmets, transport components, and heavy artillery were melted down. All this metal mass was converted into railroad rails, agricultural machinery parts, factory structures, train cars, and electrical grid components. It was war recycling taken to the extreme. In fact, in some industrial regions of the USSR, it was estimated that a good portion of the steel produced during those years came from captured war material. For the Soviet government, it was not only a practical or economic issue, but also a symbolic one. The Nazi weapons that had devastated the country were now being integrated into the foundations of its rebirth. This effort was integrated with other large-scale recovery operations, such as the famous Operation Ossowiakim, in which not only thousands of tons of German machinery and industrial equipment were transported to Soviet territory, but also entire teams of engineers, technicians, and scientists who were forced to work on the technological and military reconstruction of the USSR. However, this stage, the purely metallurgical recovery, had a very specific character. It was no longer a matter of appropriating ideas or patents, but of literally converting enemy steel into Soviet steel. Everything that could not be reused, everything that had no strategic value, was unceremoniously melted down. Unlike the United States and Great Britain, which maintained huge captured arsenals as emergency reserves or distributed them on international markets, Moscow viewed maintaining large quantities of German weapons as a political and military risk. Therefore, the priority was their systematic destruction and transformation into civilian products. Through this process, old Nazi siege guns ended up converted into railway bridge columns. Deactivated rifles became sleepers and rails, and armored steel plates were used to manufacture heavy machinery or electrical infrastructure. The result was that within a few years, a large part of the enemy arsenal was absorbed, almost dissolved, into the Soviet industrial network. This massive recycling of Nazi weapons also provided valuable technical data. The engineering of the guns, the alloys used in armor and ammunition designs informed Soviet studies of ballistics and metallurgy. Thus, the destruction of that arsenal not only provided raw materials but also knowledge. Ultimately, the metallurgical recovery of German war trophies was one of the least known but most illustrative episodes of the Soviet effort to transform destruction into reconstruction. It was a radical example of how the material legacy of war, even the weapons of a mortal enemy, could literally be cast into the foundations of a new industrial and political order. Ballistic and Materials Research at NRI-24. After the fall of the Third Reich, much of the German arsenal captured by the Soviet Union found an unexpected fate. Instead of being stored indefinitely in military depots or redistributed among Allied countries, many of these weapons were sent to research centers, where Soviet engineers transformed them into key elements for materials science and ballistics experimentation. One of the main settings for these studies was the Soviet Central Ballistics Institute known as NRI-24. There, in heavily guarded facilities, secret tests were carried out on MG-42 machine guns and PaK-40 anti-tank guns, two of the most advanced weapons systems the German military industry had ever produced. The MG-42 machine gun stood out for its extraordinary rate of fire. It could fire more than 1,000 rounds per minute, exerting constant mechanical stress on its structure. This characteristic made it a perfect testbed for Soviet equipment. Under laboratory conditions, researchers completely disassembled the machine, studied its internal design, and then subjected it to experiments that recreated sustained fire far more intense than in actual combat. The goal was not simply to understand its strengths, but to explore how different steels and heat treatments performed at the limits of their endurance. By manufacturing replacement parts from experimental alloys, scientists could test whether the material could withstand extreme cycles of reheating and friction before fracturing. The PaK-40, meanwhile, was a 75mm anti-tank gun whose effectiveness in battle had been widely recognized. This system served as a benchmark in multiple fields, from ballistic penetration of high-velocity projectiles to the accuracy of rifled tubes under high internal pressures. Soviet engineers deliberately modified the chambers of several captured examples and adapted the ammunition systems. This allowed them to test not only original German shells, but also Soviet-designed ammunition. These experiments allowed them to identify the best way to optimize the barrel's internal geometry, as well as adjust the metallurgy of the tube walls to extend its useful life. But the goal of these studies wasn't plagiarism or simply copying enemy designs. The Soviet Union wanted to understand what made these weapons work so well, and based on that knowledge, develop their own models capable of surpassing them. In the NRI-24 laboratories, new chemical propellants, more efficient rifling techniques, and ways to produce cheaper, stronger, and lighter steel were tested. Declassified files show that much of these tests were kept strictly secret. The weapons were disassembled down to their smallest components, each part measured, recorded, and then rebuilt to subject them to stress levels much higher than in any real engagement. The researchers spoke of failure threshold tests, experiments designed to determine at what point a barrel would burst or a firing mechanism would cease to function. This information was vital to defining the quality requirements for future Soviet weapons. While some conclusions led to mass production models, for example improvements to Soviet anti-tank guns or heavy machine gun systems, other research was purely exploratory. This was weapons science without an immediate objective, but it helped lay the foundations for post-war ballistics knowledge. The fate of these captured weapons illustrates how the Soviet Union approached military and scientific reconstruction after World War II. While some Western nations stockpiled German weapons or redistributed them to Allied armies, Moscow transformed them into raw material for strategic research. Thus, guns that had protected Nazi armored vehicles and machine guns that had decimated the Red Army on the Eastern Front were stripped of their symbolic power and turned into learning tools. Ultimately, they ceased to be instruments of death and became laboratory specimens that would help define Soviet quality standards and shape the arsenals of the following decades. Thus, the legacy of Nazi weapons did not end with Germany's surrender. On the steel benches of Soviet institutes, they still fired, but their bullets no longer killed. They paved the way for a new generation of weapons engineering. Old German cannons in Soviet air defense. Captured German anti-aircraft guns did not remain inactive or become mere war trophies when the conflict ended. In fact, many of these powerful systems were redeployed, albeit in a very different setting. Their role was no longer to protect the Third Reich, but to safeguard the Soviet Union's airspace. Among all the seized pieces, the 105mm Flak 38 and Flak 39 heavy batteries stood out especially for their combination of long-range, high rate of fire and accuracy at altitudes that surpassed many of the Soviet models available at the end of the 1940s. These weapons had originally been designed to replace the famous 88mm Flak, and although they were too bulky and heavy for mobile use on changing fronts, their firepower and reliability were unsurpassed in static positions. With Germany's defeat, the Soviet authorities decided to utilize this captured arsenal while the domestic industry developed its own anti-aircraft systems. Thus, in the years following the war, many of these guns were rapidly redeployed to strategic locations, key industrial facilities, military bases, airfields, and coastal regions considered vulnerable to potential Western air raids. The Flak 38 and 39 became the provisional backbone of Soviet air defense. To operate them, crews received specific training based in part on original German manuals, firing tables, and optical systems recovered from Luftwaffe depots. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers dedicated themselves to a detailed study of the operation of their fire control systems and ammunition fuses. This reverse engineering allowed some technological solutions to be adapted and incorporated into local development programs. Although these guns lacked the maneuverability of the Soviet models being tested, such as the 57 and 85mm automatic systems, their altitude ceiling and firepower remained a highly valued tactical advantage. For a few years, they were a mainstay of air defense, as the USSR prepared to deploy more modern guns and missiles such as the S-25 Berkut system and, later, the S-75 guided missile, which would usher in a new era in anti-aircraft warfare. This deployment was neither uniform nor eternal. As Soviet arsenals were modernized and more sophisticated radars and centralized control systems were introduced, German guns began to lose relevance. By the early 1950s, most were gradually withdrawn from active service, stored in reserve depots, or dismantled entirely to use their components as spare parts and their metals as raw material for new production. However, during this interlude, they played an unusual role. Pieces designed to protect the Reich from Allied bombers ended up integrated into the Soviet front line of defense. The image of these cannons patrolling the skies above factories in Ukraine, Baltic ports, or industrial complexes in the Russian interior symbolizes a strange and little-known chapter of the post-war period. The moment when the remnants of a defeated empire were recycled and put to the service of its former enemy. This episode not only illustrates the speed with which the USSR utilized all the captured material, but also the pragmatic logic that dominated those years. The priority was to strengthen strategic security and fill the gap that the devastation of war had left in the country's air defense. For a brief but significant period, Nazi anti-aircraft guns, rather than being immediately melted down or turned into relics, remained on guard, patrolling a sky that already belonged to another power. It was, in short, a transitional period, the coexistence of German technology, budding Soviet developments, and improvised hybrid systems that helped maintain the security of the USSR until new local weapons could fully assume that role. Thus, those weapons that once represented the most feared threat to Allied aviation ended up serving for a time as involuntary sentinels of the new emerging superpower. Panzerfaust as a training aid in Great Britain. After World War II, Britain found itself literally sitting on mountains of captured Panzerfausts. These disposable anti-tank launchers, designed by the Germans as single-use weapons, had been produced by the millions in the final years of the conflict. They were so plentiful that they were standard equipment for almost any German unit defending against Allied armored advances. Faced with such a quantity of seized material, the British didn't simply destroy it. Rather than scrapping each of these launchers, military training schools saw an opportunity to convert them into valuable training tools. The process began with the removal of the explosive warheads, which were carefully dismantled to prevent accidents. The launch tubes were then strengthened to withstand simulated firing of blank or smoke charges without being damaged by repeated use. Thus were born the training Panzerfausts, inert yet fully functional launchers for rehearsing combat maneuvers. These recycled devices offered recruits a cost-effective and highly realistic way to learn how to ambush an enemy tank at close range. During the exercises, soldiers were forced to move through environments designed to simulate ruined cities, trenches, or rural areas covered with vegetation, faithfully reproducing the scenarios where the Panzerfaust had proven its lethal effectiveness. The training sessions were not simple demonstrations. They were often intense and physically exhausting. Recruits had to crawl through narrow corridors or lie down for long periods waiting for a moving target, usually a simulated vehicle or wooden armored target, to appear just 10 or 20 meters away. At that point, they had to quickly get up, aim and fire the smoke salvo, replicating every step of the procedure of a real launch. Beyond the financial savings, this use had an underlying educational purpose. British instructors understood that the Panzerfaust had radically changed the balance of power between infantry and armored vehicles during the war. A single person, armed with a simple, lightweight tube, could destroy a tank if they managed to get close enough. Converting these launchers into practice replicas allowed British soldiers to learn exactly what engaging a tank entails. how to approach unseen, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to execute an accurate shot in just a few seconds. This experience proved doubly valuable when, in the following years, Britain began deploying new weapons of its own design that followed the same principle: single-use, easy-to-handle, shaped-charge projectiles. Prominent among these were the Energa rifle grenade and, later, NATO's celebrated LAW rocket launcher. Training with captured Panzerfausts paved the way for British infantry to seamlessly incorporate these new anti-tank technologies. In a sense, it was an ironic twist of history. The anti-tank fist that Hitler had conceived as a last, desperate line of defense ended up becoming a key training tool for the armed forces that had defeated the Third Reich. Without explosives, devoid of their original threat, these launchers became a teaching tool that shaped British armoured warfare doctrine for much of the post-war period. Thus, the Panzerfaust met an unexpected end, from a feared weapon on European battlefields to a silent instrument in British training camps where generations of soldiers learned to confront an armoured enemy, thanks to a weapon that was once their worst nightmare. The hidden arsenal after the war. After the German capitulation in May 1945, the Allied forces stumbled upon an unexpected sight: vast secret depots scattered throughout the Reich. These were carefully camouflaged storage facilities in abandoned factories, railway tunnels, salt mines, and underground bunkers, packed to the brim with rifles, ammunition crates, hand grenades, machine guns, light artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of helmets piled in towers resembling mountains of military scrap. Some of these caches were so well concealed that even the locals didn't suspect their existence. In many villages, the population only found out when they saw Allied trucks arrive, accompanied by armed patrols, to take control of these silent depots. The scene was surreal. A regime that had boasted of its military might until the very end, now reduced to piles of inert weapons under the watchful eye of its former enemies. One of the most striking caches was found near a Wehrmacht supply center in Thuringia. There, entire corridors were found packed with Mauser rifles, M35 helmets, and boxes labeled with dates dating back to the beginning of the war. Everything was perfectly inventoried, as if the Nazi machine had been waiting for a final order that never came. For the Allies, this discovery posed a logistical and political dilemma of colossal proportions. They had to decide what to do with millions of pieces of equipment. The priority was to prevent any armed group, whether Nazi remnants or new threats, from using them to reorganize the resistance. A large portion of the material was immediately melted down. Entire convoys were sent to foundries where they were transformed into steel beams, railroad rails, and agricultural machinery that would fuel the reconstruction of devastated Europe. Another portion was used for military training. Rifles and non-explosive grenades were used by Allied academies to teach handling, disarmament, and urban combat techniques. However, not everything ended up in furnaces or training camps. Certain batches, especially those displaying advanced technological features, such as automatic weapons, precision optics, and experimental projectiles, were carefully selected and sent to laboratories and research institutes. There, engineers and historians studied them to understand how German industry had mass-produced such effective and, in many cases, innovative weapons. A small number of pieces, considered to be of high historical or propaganda value, were sent to military museums in the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. These display cases, in a sense, presented the trophies of a war that had cost tens of millions of lives. For a brief moment, these camps and depots became open-air warehouses, silent witnesses to the fall of a regime that had claimed dominance in Europe for 1,000 years. and was instead reduced to dusty inventories and metal ready for recycling. For many Germans in the occupied zones, especially in the east of the country, discovering these stockpiles was as bewildering as it was humiliating. They were tangible proof that their country had, for years, been obsessed with war and prepared for endless conflict. In the paradox of the post-war era, the arsenal that for so long symbolized conquest and terror was transformed into scrap material, resources for reconstruction, and, on occasion, museum pieces. Their final fate reflected the beginning of a new Europe, one that sought to leave the Nazi nightmare behind without forgetting the lessons it had taught. East Germany Volkspolizei armories. The fledgling East German state inherited literally mountains of Nazi weaponry scattered across warehouses, makeshift stores, and even secret hiding places when the Third Reich collapsed in 1945. Among these war chests were thousands of MP-40 submachine guns, Luger pistols, Kar-98K carbines, semi-automatic rifles, anti-tank guns, ammunition of all calibers, and artillery pieces. Far from being immediately discarded, this entire arsenal was systematically channeled into the hands of the new Volkspolizei, the brand new People's Police Force created under Soviet supervision in the Eastern Occupation Zone. At first glance, it might have appeared to be a civilian force charged with public security, but in reality it was much closer to a paramilitary militia. It had mechanized units, access to armored vehicles, the ability to deploy heavy fire, and, above all, a very clear political mandate. The priority of this new force was not only to maintain order in a war-ravaged society, but also to enforce the communist regime's rule in a Germany divided in two. For the Soviet government, this enormous Nazi arsenal was ideal. It provided the East German state with immediate firepower without relying entirely on expensive shipments of Soviet material. Thus, former Wehrmacht rifles began to reappear in urban patrols, border checkpoints, and counterinsurgency operations. During its early years, the Volkspolizei was a deeply unstable institution. It suffered from constant personnel turnover, lacked a well-established professional corps, and was constantly under suspicion. Soviet political commissars distrusted many of its members, particularly those who had served in the German army or had been prisoners of war in the West. Any officer with family ties across the border or dubious political loyalties was immediately purged. The priority was to model the force on a Soviet model, tightly controlled, ideologically reliable, and willing to defend the communist regime at all costs. This purge was relentless. As former Wehrmacht officers disappeared from the chain of command, the Volkspolizei became an organization increasingly subservient to Soviet interests. Paradoxically, however, the arsenals that sustained it remained the same ones Hitler had used to conquer Europe. What was most striking was how long they remained in service. In the early 1950s, it was not uncommon to see patrols in East Berlin armed with MP-40 submachine guns and Kar-98K rifles, the exact same models used on the Eastern Front a decade earlier. Some units even continued to use Nazi-origin helmets and harnesses out of sheer material necessity. The new state simply did not have the production capacity to replace all of its equipment at once. Little by little, Mosin Nagant rifles, SKS carbines, and finally the first Soviet Kalashnikovs began to arrive, but the process was slow and uneven. Archival photographs show Volkspolizei officers at this time as a curious patchwork: adapted uniforms, newly sewn socialist insignia, and in their hands, weapons still emblazoned with the Reich Imperial Eagle. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that the systematic replacement of this inherited equipment with standard Warsaw-packed weaponry began: Makarov pistols, AK rifles, and newly manufactured submachine guns. Even so, for almost 2 decades, The military legacy of Nazism continued to patrol streets, guard border posts, and ensure the control of a regime completely opposed to the one that had forged them. In a historical twist fraught with irony, the very weapons that had served Hitler's expansion ended up guaranteeing the dominance of socialist Germany, consolidating a border that divided its people. Thus, the Reich's old rifles ended up becoming instruments of the new communist orthodoxy, a reminder that history rarely fits into compartments as neatly as we might like. During those years, while the West was rebuilding its own order and throwing itself into NATO, in the East, the tools of Nazi war prolonged their existence in the hands of soldiers and policemen defending a regime that declared itself fighting precisely everything Hitler stood for. This paradox encapsulates the complexity of post-war Germany, a world where ideology could change direction in an instant, but steel remained as a reminder that no new beginning is as pure as it seems. Frontline services with Western allies. In the final months of 1944, as the Allies advanced deep into German territory, particularly fierce fighting raged in strongholds such as Geister and Kassel. There, the German defences held with almost fanatical tenacity. British forces deployed their Churchill tanks, equipped with 6-pounder and 75mm cannons, but their shots only managed to knock splinters from the thick stone walls. Each assault attempt ended in bloody failure until a very unusual vehicle turned the tide of the battle. That tank was Cuckoo, a German Panther previously captured by the British. While the defenders awaited the Churchill's frontal onslaught, the Panther began to move stealthily, choosing targets with ruthless precision. From carefully calculated positions, it fired rounds that pierced windows and opened devastating breaches like precision artillery. It was an ironic twist. The most feared weapon in the German arsenal was now reducing its own fortifications to rubble. While such scenes are shocking, the use of captured enemy vehicles was not entirely unusual. During the North African campaign, shortages forced British units to press into service Italian M1340 tanks that had surrendered or been abandoned. The 6th Royal Tank Regiment used them for a time, albeit with great reservations. Mechanical problems, unreliability, and a shortage of spare parts meant that most of these tanks lasted only a few weeks in combat condition. Once disabled, they were dismantled without remorse. The Soviets, on the other hand, adopted a much more systematic and pragmatic approach. The colossal scale of the Eastern Front, a territory where German tanks were scattered after every offensive or retreat, offered constant opportunities to capture damaged but repairable Panthers, Panzer IVs, and even Tigers. These armoured vehicles were often patched together in field workshops with improvised parts, or even with the forced collaboration of captured German mechanics. Logistics were a constant challenge. Adequate ammunition was scarce, and obtaining spare parts was a nightmare. Even so, Soviet determination and inventiveness ensured that many of these tanks remained in combat far longer than their designers had anticipated. The result was that in more than one engagement, Wehrmacht units found themselves facing familiar-looking vehicles, now sporting large red stars on the turret. To prevent inadvertent attacks by their own or other air forces, the repurposed German tanks were painted in bright colors with contrasting stripes and huge Soviet markings. Despite these precautions, mistrust persisted among the soldiers, who viewed with unease these silhouettes that, for years, had symbolized terror and destruction. The most curious thing is that some Panthers proved so effective that their crews were reluctant to abandon them, even when they were seriously damaged, or there were explicit orders to retire them. Their excellent high-velocity guns and sloped armor made them fearsome opponents, even in the hands of Soviet operators who had received little formal training in their use. Thus, while a British Panther like the Cuckoo was firing on German strongholds at Geister, other identical vehicles were fighting thousands of kilometers to the east on the snow-covered plains, defending positions conquered by the Red Army. When the conflict ended, many of these captured tanks were scrapped, turned into museum pieces, or used in ballistics experiments. However, during the final months of the war, they represented something extraordinary. Machines created for the purpose of conquest that, when they changed hands, extended their useful life in an opposing cause. It was a singular episode in which German military engineering not only served to terrorize Europe, but also to equip its enemies with a formidable instrument. For a time, these tanks became chess pieces that switched sides, symbols of a conflict where technical superiority and adaptability could emerge from the most unexpected places. Technical tests and museum pieces. After World War II, the Allies found themselves with a vast German arsenal that not only represented Nazi military might, but also a treasure trove of technical innovation that no other nation had developed with such intensity. State-of-the-art tanks, heavy artillery guns, sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, advanced aircraft components, and thousands of small arms became part of carefully catalogued military inventories. These captured pieces became strategic resources, not only because of their immediate material value, but because they offered the opportunity to understand in detail how Germany had managed to stay technologically ahead in so many areas. To that end, the United States and the United Kingdom established special facilities where this weaponry would be thoroughly evaluated. Prominent among these centers were the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland and the Farnborough Proving Ground in England. At these locations, engineers, armorers, and military analysts examined every component, from the metallurgy of the armor to the performance of the ammunition. Their findings not only helped design new generations of Western vehicles and weapons, but also influenced tactical doctrines that endured throughout the Cold War. However, the history of this arsenal did not end there. Not all captured pieces survived the turbulent post-war period intact. During the Korean conflict, American industry faced extraordinary demands for strategic metals and war materials. To supply them, many of these German weapons were ultimately dismantled in massive recycling campaigns that dismantled entire vehicles and reduced them to ingots and scrap. Even so, some equipment was saved from the foundry due to its historical significance or its usefulness as a technical reference. Some pieces were transferred to military museums or stored in large depots under Army custody. The U.S. Army Ordnance Museum, located for decades in Aberdeen, once displayed one of the most impressive collections in the world. There, the famous tank mile offered a striking glimpse into the evolution of armor from World War I to the latest Nazi models. Over the years, constant exposure to the elements severely affected these vehicles. Rain, frost, and humidity caused deep rust, deterioration of the seals, and internal corrosion of the engines. Beginning in the 1980s, extensive restoration work was undertaken to save the most valuable examples, but not all were recovered. At the same time, environmental concerns grew. Increasingly strict regulations forced the Army to identify and eliminate the contaminants leaking from these machines, aged fuel, industrial oils, and lead paint that slowly seeped into the soil on bases. These regulations accelerated the need to relocate the collections, and with the reorganization of U.S. military installations, many pieces were dispersed. For example, a considerable portion of the heavy weapons and artillery were transferred to the Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which became an important repository of artillery history. Meanwhile, the Army Armored Museum moved from its historic home at Fort Knox to Fort Benning, Georgia, as part of a broader restructuring. Fort Lee, Virginia, became another hub. Spectacular pieces arrived there, such as the gigantic M65 atomic cannon, also known as Atomic Annie, as well as the German Anzio Annie railway gun, whose caliber and range impressed technicians from around the world. Some of these weapons were installed outdoors, under large shelters, while others were stored in specialized depots with controlled environmental conditions. This redistribution process was not only logistical, but reflected a broader purpose: to preserve the historical legacy of captured Nazi weapons and ensure that their lessons, technical, tactical, and strategic, could be studied and understood by future generations. In this way, the Nazi arsenal did not disappear entirely. Although thousands of pieces were melted down or scrapped, others survived as a testament to an era in which military engineering reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and lethality. Today, these vehicles and cannons are displayed in museums or remain in storage, reminding us how the technology of the Third Reich, defeated on the battlefield, continued to influence military history long after the fighting ceased. Licensed German designs. After the end of World War II, German engineering did not disappear with the Third Reich. Many of its designs survived, finding new homes in the East, where they filtered through and were adapted into Soviet and Socialist bloc technology. A particularly iconic example was the famous BMW R-71 motorcycle. This model served as the basis for the creation of the Soviet M72, which became a mainstay of USSR military motorcycle production for decades. Similarly, German influence extended to other areas. Hanomag tractors inspired the development of the Soviet Khimar crawler tractor, while components from the Wehrmacht's rugged German military trucks ended up in the MAZ 200 trucks, which became a common vehicle throughout the Soviet sphere. The story of how the BMW R-71 ended up in Soviet hands is shrouded in mystery. Officially, it is claimed that the Soviet Union obtained a manufacturing license in 1940, acquiring detailed drawings, tools, and even the collaboration of some German engineers. However, another version states that several R-71 units were discreetly purchased in Sweden and then subjected to an extremely meticulous reverse engineering process. Every component was replicated in detail, from the wax molds to the last bolt. BMW itself maintains that there is no documentary evidence of how the Soviets ultimately obtained the motorcycle, leaving the matter open to speculation. It is possible that both stories contain some truth. What is clear is that in January 1941, the Moscow motorcycle plant produced its first batch of 1,753 M72 motorcycles, just as the threat of a German invasion became imminent. Faced with the danger of Luftwaffe air raids, the Soviet authorities ordered the urgent evacuation of production. The factory was moved first to Gorky and later even further east, to Irbit in the Ural Mountains, where it remained out of range of Nazi bombers. Thus, a German design conceived for the roads of the Reich was transformed in a matter of months into a symbol of Soviet resistance and an essential part of its military machine. Kingman Aircraft Graveyard. At the end of World War II, the Allies faced a colossal task, deciding what to do with the vast amount of weapons, vehicles, and war equipment that Nazi Germany had deployed across Europe. From Luftwaffe fighters and bombers to panzer tanks, heavy artillery pieces, and millions of rifles, this immense war booty became a logistical, political, and strategic problem of the first magnitude. Much of this material was transported to the United States for various purposes: temporary storage, technical analysis, experimentation, or simply destruction. One of the most emblematic centers of this process was Kingman, Arizona, a former U.S. Army Air Force training range. By 1946, Kingman was transformed into a vast aircraft graveyard. There, under the scorching desert sun, thousands of captured Luftwaffe aircraft were lined up in neatly organized rows that seemed endless. These machines, which just months earlier had sown terror in the skies of Europe, now lay in absolute silence, awaiting their fate. Many of these aircraft would never fly again. Although some were briefly kept as sources of spare parts or study pieces, most were eventually sold for scrap or dismantled altogether. Rapid technological developments, particularly the advent of jet engines, rendered German fighters and bombers obsolete in a matter of years. Management of this monumental inventory fell to agencies such as the War Assets Administration and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had to make pragmatic decisions: store what was strictly necessary, sell what was reusable, and destroy what posed a risk or had no strategic value. This policy was not limited to aviation alone. Panzer tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and armored vehicles followed similar trajectories. Some were sent to testing grounds, such as Aberdeen Proving Ground, where engineers and military specialists worked to dismantle them piece by piece, studying every detail of their design. These analyses were fundamental to understanding German technical innovations and applying their lessons to the development of new Allied weapons models. In fact, the most advanced German tanks, such as the Panther and the Tiger, aroused particular interest. Although they were expensive and complicated to maintain, engineers and crews tested them under simulated combat conditions to evaluate their performance and identify weaknesses. This information informed Western armored vehicle projects during the Cold War. However, most of these captured artillery pieces and armored vehicles were also not kept for long. As the pressure to reduce costs grew and the threat of the Cold War forced the prioritization of resources for new nuclear weapons and reactors, tons of equipment were auctioned off, crushed, or abandoned in open-air warehouses. Aircraft and tanks were not the only protagonists of this process. Millions of Mauser rifles, MG-42 machine guns, Luger pistols, and grenades were confiscated from German arsenals. Some of these small arms were redistributed among Allied countries or assigned to police forces in Europe, while others ended up in storage for years before being destroyed in mass disarmament campaigns. The environmental dimension of this gigantic operation was also significant. Corrosion, fuel and oil leaks, as well as the presence of hazardous materials such as asbestos, meant that in later decades many military bases had to dismantle and clean up these cemeteries of war scrap. Some unique objects, prototypes, pieces of historical value or unique models, were selected for preservation in museums. Notable among these were the tank mile at the former U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, and the collections later moved to Fort Sill and Fort Benning, where the remnants of that formidable arsenal that once served the Third Reich can still be seen today. The remainder met a more prosaic end, crushed, melted down, or buried permanently. Ultimately, although a small fraction of these weapons survive today in display cases, exhibitions, or private collections, the vast majority returned to dust, converted into raw material, or erased from public memory. Thus closed the final chapter of Nazi military might, not with a final battle, but with the slow demise of its machinery in a bureaucratic process that transformed war into scrap metal and fear into history. The Fjord side dumps. Following the German surrender in 1945, Norway suddenly faced a logistical and security challenge of colossal proportions. In a country with a rugged and indented coastline stretching for more than 1,550 miles, Some 30,000 Allied troops were tasked with disarming 350,000 German soldiers scattered across coastal fortresses, air bases, ammunition depots, and sentry posts. This titanic effort involved more than just taking prisoners or requisitioning handguns. One of the most urgent and dangerous problems was managing vast stockpiles of bombs, heavy artillery, and ammunition, some of which had been deliberately abandoned in unstable conditions or mined to create booby traps. With limited human resources and the constant threat of accidents, sabotage, or looting, the Norwegian authorities made a decision as drastic as it was controversial: to submerge some 168,000 tons of captured German weapons and explosives in lakes and fjords. This was not simply a cleanup or disposal operation. It was a strategic measure seeking to contain an immediate risk in a newly liberated country, where there was a persistent fear that the entire arsenal would end up in the hands of desperate civilians or communist groups that, after the war, were increasingly active and organized. Marine biologist John Key, who decades later studied these submerged dumps as part of his master's thesis, described the mentality of the time clearly. The great fear was that the bombs and ammunition could be stolen or used for political purposes, creating even more instability in a country that had already suffered 5 years of occupation and resistance. Norway had remained neutral until April 1940, when it was invaded by Nazi Germany. Throughout the war, the population lived under constant pressure from a puppet regime, repression, and surveillance. The country, strategically located facing the North Sea, became a focal point of naval and air warfare. With the liberation in May 1945 came the urgency of restoring sovereignty and normalcy, but also the need to dispose of the most dangerous remnants of the conflict. Today, almost 80 years later, these weapons shipments remain hidden beneath the surface. John Key and his team of researchers work with remotely operated underwater vehicles, tracking and documenting the remains of that arsenal submerged in the deep Norwegian fjords. What were once deadly bombs and high-powered shells now form artificial reefs that surprisingly support marine life. In places like the Trondheim Fjord, cold-water corals, schools of fish and other species adapted to the presence of rusty hulls and metal structures have been observed. Thus, those weapons, full of death and destruction, have been transformed over time into unexpected habitats, silently memorializing a submerged chapter of history. However, beneath the patina of underwater life, the mystery persists about the potential environmental risk of these arsenals, some of which contain chemical munitions. For now, they remain an ambiguous legacy, testimony to an extreme decision taken in the name of security and a reminder of how war can still resonate decades later beneath the cold waters of a fjord. Chemical weapons at sea. Following the capitulation of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the Allied armies faced a logistical and moral challenge that few had anticipated: the location, cataloguing, and destruction of one of the largest and most dangerous arsenals ever assembled on European soil. Of all the weapons the Third Reich had produced and stockpiled throughout the war, none caused greater concern than the vast stockpiles of chemical weapons. It is estimated that scattered in secret depots, underground bunkers, factories and armored trains, the Nazis left behind around 300,000 tons of chemical munitions. There was everything from artillery shells filled with deadly gases, aerial bombs loaded with blister agents, drums of mustard gas and Louisite, and stockpiles of chemical precursors intended for the manufacture of new weapons. In the final months of the war, when defeat was inevitable, many of these weapons were hastily abandoned or hidden away without detailed inventories or safety protocols. Upon taking control of Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France were forced to urgently define a plan to prevent this arsenal from falling into the wrong hands. Political tension in Europe was growing. Fear of the resurgence of extremist movements, the rise of communist parties in several countries, and the arrival of the Cold War fueled the perception that these chemical weapons could trigger a new catastrophe if left uncontrolled. To coordinate the response, the Continental Committee on Chemical Dumps was created, an organization tasked with assigning responsibilities to each occupying power according to the zones under its administration. The committee's mandate was clear: identify chemical stockpiles, inventory their contents, define their final destination, and proceed with their disposal. But the mandate on paper was one thing, and the technical complexity of executing it was another. Conventional disarmament was already a monumental task. Disarming and transporting chemical projectiles, many of which were damaged or stored precariously, posed an immediate risk of explosions, leaks, and fatal accidents. Furthermore, Europe's industrial infrastructure was devastated. Factories, laboratories, and destruction plants had been bombed or dismantled. Controlled incineration on land was expensive, slow, and extremely dangerous. Faced with this situation, the Allied powers made a decision that is now considered controversial: to sink most of these chemical weapons at sea. Thousands of tons of munitions were packed in unprotected wooden crates or hastily sealed metal barrels. They were then loaded onto military vessels and transported to deep-water areas. Dumping was concentrated mainly in the Baltic Sea, especially in the Bornholm and Gotland basins. These areas were chosen for their depth and relative distance from trade routes. For months, convoys of ships made round trips, slowly unloading a colossal volume of toxic material. In the eyes of military planners, this method had several advantages. It was fast, cost-effective, and reduced the possibility of accidents on land or theft of the material. However, the environmental risks were already apparent, although they were considered a minor issue compared to the urgency of immediately eliminating the danger. It was assumed that the cold water and great depth would permanently seal out the chemical agents. In practice, time proved this belief to be erroneous. The wooden crates degraded within a few years, opening cracks that let poisonous gases and corrosive agents escape to the seabed. The metal drums, made of common steel and without specific anti-corrosion treatment, began to rust. In the following decades, their contents began to slowly seep into the Baltic seabed. This environmental crisis was not limited to the Baltic Sea either. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union carried out similar dumping operations in the North Atlantic and the Pacific, often without detailed records of the exact locations. In some cases, the coordinates were recorded in simple logbooks that were eventually lost or classified and then forgotten. Decades later, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Fishing vessels operating in traditionally chemical-rich areas began hauling in nets contaminated with chemical residues. Some fishermen suffered severe burns upon contact with reactive mustard gas. Coastal communities began to document increases in respiratory problems, skin lesions, and health risks linked to the dispersal of these materials. Currently, marine scientists and environmental authorities in coastal countries are working against the clock to identify the areas of greatest contamination and assess the risks. Unmanned submersible vehicles and advanced sonar systems are being used to locate deposits and study the degree of deterioration of the containers. Pilot projects are testing technologies to encapsulate the most critical sources and mitigate their release. What was once considered a pragmatic solution to an urgent problem, eliminating the Third Reich's chemical weapons, has become a silent but persistent environmental crisis, the full effects of which are only just beginning to be understood. Meanwhile, beneath the icy waters of the Baltic and other seas, thousands of tons of poisonous gases continue their inexorable corrosion process, a reminder that decisions made in haste can leave a toxic legacy that lasts for generations. The renaissance of V-2 rockets at White Sands. After World War II, captured Nazi weapons, especially V-2 rockets, became key strategic assets for the Allied powers, marking the beginning of a new competition, the race for technological supremacy in the midst of the Cold War. What had begun as a conventional military struggle eventually transformed into a fierce scientific and industrial dispute, in which German knowledge became more valuable than the conquered territories themselves. The V-2s, the world's first ballistic missiles, represented the pinnacle of the Third Reich's weapons program. Designed by engineers such as Wernher von Braun, these rockets had been used by Germany to bomb London and other European cities, causing terror and destruction from heights unattainable by the defensive systems of the time. But after the German surrender, they ceased to be symbols of Nazi horror and became the linchpin of a new technological ambition, the conquest of space and strategic dominance through missiles. The United States was quick to act. Under the name Operation Paperclip, military and intelligence authorities launched an ambitious secret program to locate and recruit the most valuable German scientists, technicians, and engineers before they fell into Soviet hands. In total, more than 1,500 specialists were brought to American soil, many of them with direct ties to the Nazi Party, but whose technical knowledge was considered too valuable to ignore. Among them was Wernher von Braun and his team from the Peenemünde Rocket Center, who were taken first to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then to the missile testing range at White Sands, New Mexico. In parallel, more than 300 train cars filled with V-2 missile parts, engines, airframes, and technical documentation were shipped from Germany to the United States. At White Sands, American engineers began rebuilding the V-2s piece by piece, studying every screw, every valve, and every guidance system. The rockets were launched as test prototypes, known as sounding rockets, which reached record heights. In 1946, one of these V-2s captured the first photograph of Earth from space, marking a historic milestone in the nascent space age. From these tests, the United States achieved significant advances that would eventually lead to the development of intercontinental missiles and later the space program that culminated in the moon landing. However, it wasn't just about rockets. The transfer of German knowledge was much broader. Classified documents, technical drawings, inertial navigation models, and ballistic trajectory equations were directly incorporated into the new U.S. military programs. Designs such as the Atlas, Redstone, and Minuteman rockets, key to the Cold War nuclear arsenal, have their conceptual roots in German engineering of the 1940s. At the same time, other Allied powers also entered this technological race. The Soviet Union carried out its own operation to seize scientists, factories, and equipment. Although they failed to capture von Braun, they did seize some of his equipment and a large quantity of missiles and documents. Soviet engineers, led by Sergei Korolev, used this knowledge as the basis for their own space program, which would later launch the first satellite, Sputnik, and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. Great Britain and France also recovered designs, machinery, and prototypes that influenced their aviation and artillery programs, albeit on a more limited scale than those of the two superpowers. But while some rockets were launched in the name of science, many others were simply destroyed or scrapped. Pieces deemed useless for research were stored, melted down, or ended up on display as war trophies. Still, the impact of this technology transfer was profound. The weapons of the Third Reich, designed for total war, became the seed of a new age of exploration and global power. In short, V-2 rockets and the science behind them did not die with the Reich. They were reborn in the form of space capsules, intercontinental missiles, and artificial satellites. The knowledge captured from Nazi Germany became one of the pillars of the Cold War, and the engine that propelled humanity beyond Earth's atmosphere. It was an ambivalent legacy, born of destruction but destined to build the future, buried and forgotten hiding places. At the end of World War II, Europe was littered not only with ruins and human scars, but also with a silent and dangerous legacy. Thousands of weapons caches, buried, abandoned, or simply forgotten in fields, forests, mountains, and deserts from the Atlantic to the sands of Libya. Much of this weaponry was intentionally hidden during the final days of the conflict. Other times, it was simply left behind in the chaos of retreat or surrender. 80 years later, many of these arsenals still lie underground, dormant, waiting to be found. One of the most striking examples comes from the lush forests along the border between Poland and Germany, a territory that was the scene of constant battles between 1939 and 1945. In this war-scarred area, a group of Polish explorers, the Perkin Exploration Association, made an astonishing discovery after following the account of an old man who remembered a story his grandfather had told him. According to that testimony, a cache of weapons had been buried near the ancient town of Repen shortly after the end of the conflict. What began as a family legend ended up revealing a war treasure buried for decades. After weeks of investigation, the team found the hiding place. Inside, they found an impressive collection: German MP-40 submachine guns, Soviet PPSH-41 machine guns, revolvers, Mauser rifles, and even a rare French LER-35 rifle. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Who had buried this arsenal? For what purpose? A widely accepted theory suggests that these weapons were hidden by anti-Soviet resistance fighters operating underground during the post-war period, concealing weapons that would have cost them their lives if discovered by communist authorities. But this discovery, fascinating as it is only the tip of the iceberg. Across continental Europe, the remnants of World War II continue to come to light. In France, Belgium, and Germany, farmers still find unexploded shells, rusty grenades, and remnants of barbed wire while working the land. It is estimated that approximately 15% of the ordnance dropped during the war never exploded on impact, posing a latent threat that has persisted to this day. In Normandy, for example, where the famous Operation Overlord took place, farmers commonly collect what they call the Iron Harvest each year, a mixture of bullets, shells, shrapnel, helmets, rusted tools, and pieces of weaponry buried on their land since D-Day. These relics are not only dangerous but also remind us of the vast and enduring nature of the conflict. In some areas, there are even specialized teams that scour the fields to detonate old explosives, a silent but vital task for ensuring rural security. Many of the stockpiles discovered in the past were removed by Allied forces after the war. Some weapons were stored, others were immediately destroyed for fear of their reuse, and many were sold or donated to Allied countries in subsequent conflicts. But others were simply buried or hidden, often by local people fearing political reprisals or repression in uncertain times. Reasons ranged from survival to the simple desire to preserve a tool that, in a devastated Europe, could mean protection or power. Today, many of these weapons reappear by chance. Rain, erosion, deforestation, and construction projects have brought these buried fragments of the past to light. Some are displayed in museums or private collections, others are destroyed by explosives experts. But many more remain where they were left, still hidden, like specters of steel and gunpowder waiting for their moment to surface. These finds are not just rusted pieces of the past. They force us to face a reality. The war didn't completely end in 1945. Its remnants are still with us, hidden beneath layers of earth, waiting to be rediscovered. And every time one of these forgotten arsenals comes to light, it resurrects a buried chapter of history that we have yet to fully understand. Who knows what other secrets await beneath our feet, hidden beneath decades of silence?